get off screen while you're there.
Greetings. I am delighted to introduce the Wade celebration of the novel written by my co-director and husband, Looking for the King, which was originally published in 2010, and it got an amazing response. Readers were very impressed with how David was able to capture the psychology of a cynical 20-something grappling with Christianity, maybe because when he was in his 20s, he was grappling as well, and how he was able to present the characters of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and Charles Williams in the novel, who interact with this young man from America who goes to England and meets a woman in England. Two of my colleagues at Messiah College told us that they could not put down the novel when they started reading it. And David actually got a gift from a stranger in Alabama who, after he read this novel, Looking for the King, sent him coffee and said, I would like to host you at the 50-yard line of an Alabama college game. So this novel has received really positive responses, which explains why, even though it was originally published in 2010, a decade later, Paraclete Press had decided that it wanted to republish it, and that's what we're celebrating tonight. First, David will explain what generated the novel. Then he and I will do a dramatic reading from the novel about how the cynical 20-something meets this feisty young woman. And that will be followed by a question and answer time. So anytime during tonight's presentation, you can enter your questions. Be sure to enter them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom rather than the chat, and we'll be sure to answer them. And then be sure to stay tuned to learn how 3 of you might be able to receive a free copy signed by David of his novel. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Crystal, my co-director and spouse of many decades. And I want to talk a little bit about where the novel came from. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint about the process of composing the novel. Looking for the King, an Inklings novel. I wrote this because when Chris and I go to conferences, people often ask, wouldn't you love to have been a fly on the wall at an Inklings meeting? Or wouldn't you love to go to lunch with Lewis or go to Tolkien's house for a tutorial, which he often did? And I said, you know, I think I've read so much about these authors and I know their letters. I think I might be able to reconstruct what it might be to meet these two, perhaps in the early days before they were that famous. So I set this novel, Looking for the King, in 1940. 2 Americans, Tom McCord and Laura Hartman, they meet in Oxford, and they are both have their own different quest of looking for the king. Tom is looking for King Arthur, and Laura is trying to get an answer to some of her strange dreams she's been having. She feels like there's something in England that will help explain her perplexing dreams. So my novel is about 2 young Americans in 1940. That's right when the war is starting, World War II, and they meet Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams, and they get valuable clues in each of their quests. So let's talk about, we had a wonderful time researching this novel because I knew I was going to write about Tom wants to write a book called Arthur Through the Ages, in which he discusses all the layers of Arthurian legend. From the original history, maybe back in the 5th century, there really was a King Arthur, probably a Romanized Celt who fought against the Anglo-Saxons. He probably used cavalry to keep them out of the West Country for 50 or 100 years. And gradually he became this iconic figure, this epic figure. So there's history, but then there's a lot of great Arthurian romance, and eventually it becomes a kind of legend or myth. So as Tom explores these things, Chris and I wanted to go to England and make sure we had a clear picture of the kind of places Tom might have visited in 1940. So this is Tintagel in Cornwall, which both Lewis and Tolkien visited. Tolkien loved Cornwall. He just loved the powerful waves beating against the cliffs. Lewis was a bit disappointed. He thought it was already commercialized back in the 30s. And also, he didn't expect all the tin mines and the rickety fences and things that he found in Cornwall. But they both loved Tintagel. It's right in the ocean. It's this ancient fortress. It doesn't actually go back to King Arthur, the 5th century, probably built in the 11th century, but it evokes very strongly the feeling of what it would be like to have a Celtic fortress by the sea. So Tom visits Tintagel, as we did. He goes to Dosmary Pool in Bodmin Moor, which is obviously more in the interior, not too far from Tintagel. And traditionally, this beautiful pool in the moors is where King Arthur received Excalibur. The Lady of the Lake gave him the sword originally, and then as he was dying, or as he was mortally wounded, he told his assistant Bedivere to throw it back into the lake, and Bedivere threw it in the lake, and a woman's hand came out and grabbed it and swirled it 3 times and then drew it back into the lake. When Chris and I were there, I couldn't help myself. I picked up a branch about 3 feet long and I threw it in the lake to see if the Lady of the Lake would grab it and twirl it 3 times and then bring it back in the water, and nothing happened. But later I actually brought that into the novel. Tom's a little like me. He wanted to see if there was still some magic left in Dosmary Pool. Then we visited Glastonbury, which is another site for a couple of chapters in the novel, the opening chapter and the closing chapter. It's a beautiful old abbey, which is now in ruins, but there's a marker that says, "This is where lies Arthur and Guinevere." And some people think that's historically significant. Other people think that as the abbey was falling apart, someone conveniently discovered some bodies, which they claimed to be Arthur and Guinevere, and it became a major site from pilgrims. So we talk about that in the novel, whether or not that's an authentic Arthurian site or not. Also, Glastonbury is a beautiful town. Glastonbury Tor is a big tower up on the hill. You can see the steps up on the right. When Crystal and I visited, as we were coming back down, I said, "Crystal," and she looked over her shoulder. And I got this beautiful picture of her looking up at the Tor with all this wonderful landscape in the background. I posted it on Facebook. A few years later, when we were going back to Glastonbury, I went to the Glastonbury tourist site, and there was a picture of Crystal looking back up at the Tor. So apparently they stole the picture from my Facebook site. I wrote them about it, and they said, once you put it on Facebook, it's pretty much public domain. But I was flattered that they would take my picture from Facebook and put it on their tourist site there at Glastonbury. So Tom and Laura go to Glastonbury. They're trying to find out the secret of King Arthur. Was he actually there? Eventually, as the novel develops, they develop more of an interest in the spear of destiny, which was the spear that pierced the side of Christ. So in many ways, Tom's his quest for the king, it starts out as King Arthur. Later on, he and Laura together are more interested in the spear of destiny, because that seems to be what she's dreaming about. In some ways, the character of Laura is an homage to a character in a Charles Williams novel who is dreaming realities, also in That Hideous Strength. It's a motif among the Inklings that a young woman having disturbing dreams can actually be dreaming realities. They're not just these strange, perplexing products of the unconscious. So we went to, they go to Glastonbury, they try to figure out what's going on. Eventually they go to Oxford. They're told they need to talk to Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams, who are all great scholars. And this becomes, for me, the fun part of the novel. I took their letters and their books, and I picked out phrases which sounded more conversational, and I worked them into conversation. So I tried to give people a feeling of what it might be like to actually meet these characters in person. Owen Barfield said that Lewis and Tolkien, both their conversational style was similar to their letter writing style. So if you found a great phrase from their letters, that might be very similar to the kind of thing they might have said in person. So I had a lot of fun taking their books and letters and transforming them into dialogue. So this is, they go to Oxford. In one of the early chapters, Tom McCord goes to the Turf Tavern, which is the oldest tavern in Oxford. It's been there since Chaucer's time. It's got such a low roof that you would pretty much hit your nose on the entrance unless you're willing to duck down. You go inside and it's got scuffed floors and these old stone walls, but Lewis and Tolkien both loved it. So Tom has lunch with C.S. Lewis and they talk about Arthurian legend, and they talk about why would a young man like Tom be coming to England when there's a war on. The war began in the fall of 1939, and this is set in the spring and summer of 1940. And Tom says, my father doesn't really understand, but I think you need to go ahead and do your work regardless of the dangers. And Lewis quite approves, and a lot of Lewis's lines are from learning in wartime. It was fascinating for me. It was fun for me to take a lot of phrases from Lewis's essays and letters and put them into conversation. So we have a lively conversation at the Turf Tavern. And then Lewis says, you need to meet Charles Williams. He knows a lot about the Holy Grail. He knows a lot about King Arthur. So if you're trying to find out about historical foundations, you need to go hear a lecture from him. And luckily that same year, Williams actually gave a lecture on chastity at the Divinity School. They're one of the most beautiful interiors anywhere in England, Lewis said. And that's certainly true. If you go visit it, you're just overwhelmed by these wonderful fan vaults. So Williams literally gave a lecture on chastity in 1940, which is very influential. The students were amazed. It's really not a negative virtue of refraining. It's a positive virtue of being able to honor your body. And it was, Lewis was blown away. He said, this is the first time I've seen someone at Oxford actually dispensing wisdom to a whole group of young people. Whereas Hugo Dyson, the kind of witty, cynical member of the Inklings, said, well, if Charles Williams keeps lecturing on this topic, I'm going to worry he's going to be a common chastitute. So anyway, I have a chapter where he goes and hears about the Holy Grail from Charles Williams in this beautiful interior of the Divinity School. Charles Williams kind of changes the focus from, maybe this isn't about the Holy Grail, the cup that may have been at the Last Supper of Jesus. It may have been the cup which captured some of Jesus' blood when he was pierced by the Roman soldier, who's traditionally called Longinus. And maybe it's more about the Spear of Destiny. This is also a sacred relic. Everybody knows about the Holy Grail, but the Spear of Destiny is the spear the Roman soldier used to pierce the side of Christ. And many people think that it's actually a much older tradition than the Holy Grail. This has been going on since Constantine. Several people feel like they got the Spear of Destiny, and it became for them a valuable relic in terms of their ability to conquer others or to win battles. Constantine said that first. So Tom's interest switches from the Holy Grail to the Spear of Destiny, this spear which supposedly pierced the life of the side of Christ and has become a relic ever since. So here's some Charles Williams. Charles Williams tells them that they probably need to go to, they need to travel east in order to find the Spear of Destiny. I'll talk about that in a second. The Spear of Destiny, let me just say, also known as the Spear of Longinus, the Holy Lance, and this is another relic, which, as I say, has a much longer history than the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail legends only came up during the time in which the church was really struggling with what is Holy Communion? Is this a miraculous event every time you go to Mass in which you assimilate the nature of Christ, his body and blood, or is it more of a memorial? And obviously the Protestants and the Catholics came to a big division over that issue. But they, just as they were talking about the nature of the cup and the bread, the tradition of the Holy Grail became very strong in romance. There's some kind of a cup which has qualities which no one can capture. And so, as I say, that relic is not as long, is not as historic as the Spear of Longinus. This tradition goes all the way back to Constantine, Constantine, Charlemagne, King Athelstan of the Saxons all claimed to have owned it, and it gave them victory in battle. So it became a kind of talisman. Napoleon sought it unsuccessfully during his Austrian campaign. He heard that it was somewhere in one of the Prussian cities that he was attempting to conquer, and they quickly moved it out to make sure he didn't capture it. And Some legends say that Hitler was fascinated by the Holy Lance, the Heilige Lanz, on display in Vienna. He took it and kept it in a secret crypt in Nuremberg. So I'm not sure that's true, and I don't think it's true, but it's fascinating how the sacred spear has had all these fables and legends and magical associations throughout the centuries. So different people give them different ideas about where to look for the Holy Lance or the Spear of Destiny or the Spear of Longinus. Williams says you probably ought to look over in Hartford. Williams went to school in Hartford, and there's a wonderful cavern in Royston, which is underground. The Knights Templar explored it and left a lot of cryptic symbols in this cave underneath. And people think somehow those cryptic symbols will explain the Spear of Destiny. So first, Tom and Laura go to Hartford looking for clues about the Spear of Destiny. St. Albans Cathedral. St. Albans is where Williams went to school. This is a picture of the cathedral through an old Roman wall. There's an eroded spot which turns into a window. And we had so much fun researching this novel. I've never had so much fun doing research. Normally I think of the payoff being when you write the final product, but for Crystal and I, the research, we felt a little bit like Tom and Laura, researching the Spear of Destiny. Then they hear from someone in Royston or near Royston that there's a wonderful cross up in Gosforth, which should be examined because it has a picture on the cross. It's 9th century. It's pre-Norman conquest. The Danes left this big high cross in Gosforth. And for some reason, they seem to be thinking about the Spear of Destiny because they have an image on the cross of Christ being pierced in the side. So we went up to Lake Windermere, beautiful area in the Lake District. And we discovered at Gosforth in the Lake District, there really is a 9th century Danish high cross right there in the churchyard or the cemetery. And they have a close-up in the inside the church, and you see on one of the sides, there's a man who seems to have his arms outstretched, and someone is piercing his side, and there's blood coming from his side. There's a woman trying to minister to him. She has a braided knot in her hair, almost like a Scandinavian woman. But the other 3 sides of the cross are Scandinavian images of the Twilight of the Gods and Fenris Ulf and other images from Danish mythology. But for some reason on the east face, there's an image which looks very much like the crucifixion. And some scholars believe that this is the early evangelization of the Danes or the Vikings, that the Christian mythology is beginning to make its way into their worldview. So they go examine that. Someone else says they need to go to Malmesbury. This is Tolkien. They have a chapter in which they meet Tolkien. They go to his study at his home, and he's kind of an eccentric character there in his study. He did take students in his home there. And he says, you need to go to Malmesbury. There was an important Saxon king named King Athelstan who said that he had the Spear of Destiny. So you need to go down there and check that out. So there's a chapter in which they talk to Tolkien. It was a lot of fun to try to capture his personality in a chapter. And then they go to Malmesbury. Chris and I are later going to read a chapter on their way down to Malmesbury and look in search of more information about the Spear of Destiny. Once they get to Malmesbury, they discover the windows, which are still there, by a famous pre-Raphaelite painter. He did these, Edward Burne-Jones did these 3 stained glass windows. The names have been changed, but the original name of the figure on the right was the centurion. They seem to be thinking about the centurion who pierced the side of Christ, and there's that big spear there. So they're thinking maybe Athelstan really did have the spear. Maybe these stained glass windows are a tribute to the fact that the spear is somewhere in Malmesbury. It's an interesting cathedral in that it has a watching loft. There's this architectural feature up on the 2nd story, which looks like a special box at an opera house. Some people think that was for guards to look at all the relics. Athelstan was a famous collector of relics, including possibly the Spear of Destiny. And other people think it was for important people coming to High Mass. They got their own box seats to watch High Mass. So that's another part of their drama. They have some people who decide that they're onto something important. So there's some mysterious villains who keep photographing them and showing up and watching them. They see the shadow of someone in the watching loft who seems to be trying to hijack their quest for the Spear of Destiny. They go back to Glastonbury eventually. They go to St. Michael's Tower on Glastonbury Tor, which I talked about earlier. Beautiful site. They go to a parish church at Pilton. Crystal and I went to Pilton, and we were interested in biblical materials going all the way back from, English traditions going all the way back to the Bible. One of the strongest ones is that Jesus visited Britain in his youth. And there in Pilton, we saw a banner in the front of the church. This is fairly near Glastonbury, where you see the Holy Child in the front of the boat with a halo around him. And that's Joseph of Arimathea. They say that he was a very successful tin merchant. That's why he was wealthy and he could afford to pay for a tomb for Jesus. And he took Jesus all the way with him to the tin mines of England as a part of his apprenticeship. So they believe very strongly that Jesus visited England. And we love that tradition. When Crystal and I went there and said, we're looking for some information about the idea that Joseph of Arimathea may have brought Jesus to England. And this one said, oh yeah, old Joe. Yeah, he was here. Old Joe, I remember. I mean, they almost say it as if he's their grandfather. This goes back 2,000 years. And someone else said, oh yes, Big Joe. And they actually showed us a big post, which looks like a bittern on a dock, but it was all worn out. It says that's where the Romans used to tie their boats up when they were looking for tin from England. And that's where Joseph of Arimathea brought Jesus. And they have quite a developed idea that Jesus visited England. They have a pretty strong sense. For a long time, the English felt that they were an exceptional people, the way sometimes Americans feel now. And why wouldn't Jesus come to England in his adolescence? What was he doing all those years before his public ministry in Jerusalem? There's actually an interesting book called Did Jesus Come to Britain, which makes a case that, yes, he did as an adolescent. He wanted to check out other cultures and tribes than those he knew in the Middle East. And they say that when Jesus says, well, I have other sheep that you know not of, he's thinking of his friends, the English. They were so good to him when he visited there. There's a famous song, if you ever saw the movie, Chariots of Fire, there's a famous song at the beginning which says, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? These words come from William Blake. It's been turned into a very famous hymn. As I say, you see it in the movie Chariots of Fire. They even think that when Jesus slept amid the storm on the Sea of Galilee, the reason he could sleep is he'd been across the English Channel. He knew of some really turbulent waters, and a local storm on a lake just wouldn't really affect him that much. So they actually think that helps explain how Jesus could sleep amid this terrible storm, is because he'd traveled so far. He'd been in much more turbulent waters. So that was fun for us to discover. We had so much fun researching the novel. After they've gone in all these different directions, Tom and Laura decide they need to go back and talk to Lewis and Tolkien and Williams and try to sort out what they've learned at all these different sites about the Spear of Destiny. They go to the Eagle and Child. Tom visits, or he joins a meeting on a Tuesday morning where Lewis and Tolkien and Hugo Dyson and these other famous Inklings are there. And I tried to capture some of the fun of the repartee of a bunch of really intelligent, witty men of faith all talking about different topics. And so he has a wonderful experience talking about, joining the Inklings for an hour or so on a Tuesday morning. I gave you an image there of the original pub sign, which is different from the one that's there now. So at the end, we wrap up, we go to an Inklings meeting, we get insights from Lewis and Tolkien, Humphrey Havard, which is what they called the physician of the group, Charles Williams, who was very interested in the occult and kind of the dark side of spirituality, and Hugo Dyson, a very witty person who loved to bad Shakespearean puns, and I tried to invent some more Shakespearean puns for them. So together, the two of them, they have different quests. Laura is trying to understand her perplexing dreams, and Tom is trying to find a topic to write a book about. And between the two of them, they really bond. There's a kind of tension between the two of them throughout the novel. She's a Christian and he's not. He's a skeptic. But by the end of the novel, they've really come together both in their quest and in their understanding of Christian faith. So that is the general flow of the novel. I don't want to give too many Spoilers there, but that is the general flow of the novel. I had a lovely time writing it. I think if you visit these sites, I think there should be a Looking for the King tour where you would get to go to all these wonderful places Crystal and I visited. It's really fun to say, this is where he might have been born. This is where he might have gotten the spear, the sword, Excalibur. And so we had a wonderful time researching it, and I had a wonderful time writing it up. And it does give you a feeling. I have a very generous dose of what Tolkien actually said, what Williams actually said, what Lewis actually said. I actually have notes in the background. When I gave it to some proofreaders, they said, oh, Lewis would never compare free will and destiny to the problem in physics of atoms versus particles. And as a matter of fact, he did. He has a letter. He knew about contemporary physics. So I had a lot of fun writing it, but I also decided I'd go ahead and give my sources in the back. So if you doubt some of the sources of my dialogue, you can actually go back to the original documents and see where Tolkien said that, or where Lewis wrote that, or where Williams said that. So that is the general outline of the novel. Chris and I are going to give you a sample of a chapter. Neither one of us do accents, but they're both Americans, Laura Hartman and Tom McCord. We're going to give a sample chapter. They're on the way to Malmesbury just to talk about Athelstan and the watching loft and these wonderful stained glass windows, and give you some sense of, they're talking about the Inklings. So we will try to recreate that moment for you now. Imagine that I'm about 23 and she's about 21. I think
imagine.
I think that's not much of a stretch for her. It's a big stretch for me. So I should be writing novels about Santa Claus at this point in my career. Okay, on the train to Malmesbury, west of Oxford, early June. I don't remember if Matt showed up on my slide, but a critic said, Downing is so clever because they're in Oxford. At first they go east to Royston, then they go north to the Lake District, and then they go west to Malmesbury, and then they go south to Glastonbury. And they said, it's so clever how he covers all the points of the compass. And I go, that was clever. I never noticed that when I wrote the novel. So it's nice to have a critic who actually thinks you're smarter than you are. And I never try to correct them when they say that. Okay, so this is on the train to Malmesbury, west of Oxford, in early June 1940. Tom peered out the train window, but the swirling fog prevented him from seeing much beyond the line of telephone poles that ran along the tracks. He looked at Laura, who sat across from him reading Middlemarch. Tom felt disappointed not to enjoy the view on their way to Malmesbury, but there was something snug and cozy about sitting in their well-appointed railway car with wood-paneled walls and padded seats, looking at the fog outside and listening to the steady clack, clack, clack of the wheels passing over the tracks. Middlemarch, said Tom. I had to read that in Victorian Lit. You want me to tell you what happens?
No, thanks, said Laura without looking up. This is the third time I've read it.
Really? You're rereading it of your own free will?
Laura looked up and turned her head all around the car, which was empty except for the two of them, then went back to reading. Tom took this as her wordless way of saying, why else would I be reading the novel except by my own choice? After a few seconds, she looked out the window at the fog. I was hoping to see more of the Wiltshire countryside, she said.
We're only a few hours from Oxford, said Tom. Maybe you could make another day trip later this summer. You'd see a lot more on foot, he added. Jack says he doesn't like watching the landscape from a moving train. Everything goes by too fast. He says it's like reading only the first page of 100 books, one right after the other.
Jack? Which Jack are we talking about?
Jack Lewis, C.S. Lewis, that is.
Oh, Jack, is it? So you two are poker buddies now? Said Laura, closing the cover of her novel, but keeping her hand in the page she had been reading.
Hardly, said Tom. For one thing, he doesn't play poker or any game of that sort. He says he'd rather just gaze into a fire than play cards.
The man sounds like an endless font of intriguing opinions, said Laura, looking out the window again. Then turning to Tom, she says, but how do you get Jack from C.S. Lewis?
Actually, I wouldn't call him that to his face, said Tom a bit sheepishly. Apparently, he's been called that ever since he was a little boy. When he was 3 or 4, he pointed to himself, announced he was Jacksy, and wouldn't answer to any other name. Eventually, it was shortened to Jack.
And what does the CS stand for?
Clive Staples.
Oh, dear. No wonder he prefers Jack. And he calls you Tom?
He calls me McCord, explained Tom.
Not even Mr. McCord, like those starchy old school teachers?
No, just McCord. He calls most of his friends by their last names, Barfield, Dyson, Coghill. He says it's actually more personal that way. He says he's known lots of Toms, but only one McCord.
Another intriguing opinion, said Laura, smiling some more. And what about Tolkien?
Same thing. My good friend Tolkien, he says.
Well, then what does the J.R.R. stand for? More Christian names kept secret? Something like Jasper, Rasputin, Rumpelstiltskin, Tolkien?
It's stranger than that, said Tom.
Really? I can't come up with any stranger name than that.
I asked Lewis what the J.R.R. stood for. It was the same time we were discussing Clive Staples, and he scratched his head and said he really couldn't recall. He thinks one of the R's might stand for Ronald.
But he can't tell you what J stands for?
No, he's always just talking or tollers.
Now, that is strange, admitted Laura, shaking her head and smiling some more. Why does that seem so quintessentially Oxford to me?
Tom just shrugged his shoulders. You see the acting there? Tom just shrugged his shoulders. You seem to be in a jaunty mood today, he said.
Am I? As opposed to my usual grim demeanor?
No, I didn't mean that, said Tom quickly. He was on the verge of explaining himself when he realized she was just kidding. This was something new in her. He was seeing more playfulness in those dark eyes than he was accustomed to.
You might be right. I did have something on my mind, something I was worried about, but it seems to have taken care of itself.
Anything you'd like to talk about?
Laura shook her head. No, we don't need to talk about it. Just a load off my mind.
Well, now you've piqued my interest, said Tom. Can I at least try and guess?
Okay, I'll give you exactly one guess, and after that, we drop the subject.
Let's see now, mused Tom aloud. What could it be? Last week I recall quite a few sighs and faraway looks, but today you seem to find almost everything amusing.
Just the one guess, please. I can do without the commentary.
Said Tom, rubbing his chin in imitation of deep thought. You inherited a castle in Surrey? Turns out you're a long-lost countess?
Hardly, said Laura, with a dismissive wave of the hand. She acted as if that was the end of the subject, but then she suddenly tossed her head back. If you really must know, I've been jilted.
I must say, you're taking it awfully well, said Tom, both perplexed and amused.
Well, I got an aerogram from Timothy. I guess he's tired of waiting. Feels like the two of us have been drifting apart.
I'm sorry to hear that, said Tom. He didn't really mean it, but it seemed like the right thing to say.
Oh, don't be sorry, said Laura, closing her book again. It's all for the best. I've been feeling the same way. He's looking for a pastor's wife, and I'm not sure that's me. Coming over to England has made me realize how much I'm still getting to know myself. Laura looked out the window, then added quickly, oh, dear old Timothy, trying so hard to let me down easy. I feel that there is more than an ocean separating us, he wrote. Very poetic, at least for him.
Sounds to me like your young man was about to get a Dear John letter before he sent off his Dear Jane letter, or whatever you call it.
Laura sat up straighter in her seat and tugged at the lapels of her jacket. I hope you don't think this changes anything between us. I just was explaining because you were asking about my mood, but I wouldn't want you to get the wrong impression.
Of course not, said Tom, holding up his hands as if in surrender. Just friends. That didn't sound quite right, so Tom cleared his throat and tried again. Really, I appreciate all your help with my research.
Laura nodded, then seemed to find a sudden fascination in the map she was carrying. She unfolded it and checked something, folded it back up, then opened it up again, tracing her finger along a line. We must be nearing Malmesbury.
Yes, we are, answered Tom, looking out the train window. The fog was beginning to lift, and he could see a city on a hill up ahead, rising like a green island out of the milky sea.
Laura turned and looked out the window. I can see why they call it the Queen of the Hilltop Towns, she said. The train pulled into the station 10 minutes later, and the two of them got out and walked toward the Abbey ruins, a great wall of stone on the highest elevation of the city, dominating the town like a medieval fortress.
And that's the sample chapter. And then they go to Malmesbury and they visit the Abbey and meet an interesting character there. And then they have a rather disturbing episode of someone who clearly is interested in their research and wants to steal it from them. So Chris and I are quite the right readers. I should be saying, you know, if we combined your Social Security with my Social Security, we could have a good relationship. But think of Tom as early 20s and Laura is even a little bit younger. Maybe he's 23 and she's 21. So that's a sample chapter.
Okay, once again, please enter any questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Those of you who would like to enter a drawing for a free copy of David's book signed by him should email the Wade, and here's the address, wade@wheaton.edu, and put in the subject line, looking for the King book giveaway. We will announce the winners after the Q&A, and David picked out the numbers of what number of respondents will get the free books before we even signed on.
Well, one of the winners actually gets the Spear of Destiny. Is that one of the prizes tonight? Maybe not.
Now for question and answers, which will be curated by the wonderful Wade archivist, Laura Schmidt. And here she is. And feel free to ask questions of either of us, but probably David's the best person to talk about his novel.
We do have a few questions coming in already. There are a couple that are related. So Gail Harlow asks, will you be writing more Inklings novels? That would be pretty nifty, historical fiction using the Wade Center authors. And someone else asks, Roy Wallen says, in Goodreads, this novel is identified as Inklings #1. Are there other novels that make a series? And I did look on Goodreads and it does have a little Inklings ณ์1 beneath it. So perhaps you could comment about sequels, David.
I didn't intend that at the time. I wanted to satisfy people's curiosity about meeting Lewis and Tolkien in person. I wasn't thinking of a sequel. I do have one in mind. Actually, I have 3 possibilities in mind. I'm still weighing through different plot lines. It's been a while since the original, but now the reprint is out. I think I probably should get to work on another. These two, they're close to getting together, but they certainly could have another development of their relationship, as well as more insight into Lewis and Tolkien and Williams. So I'm contemplating a sequel. I'm not under contract yet, but I'm hoping one will take place sometime in the next few years.
Sounds like you already have 2 readers waiting for it. So Sydney Swanson asks, what would you say is Tom's growth arc? Did you discover it organically or work your way to it?
That's a great question, Sydney. His growth arc is very similar to my own. I didn't realize this when I wrote the novel. Be careful when you write novels because they may be more autobiographical than you realize. I thought of Tom as this guy from UCLA back in the 40s, and Laura was from back east in the 40s. And people said, oh, that's just like Crystal and you when you're traveling around England. I said, yeah, in a way it is. I started out, I was really struggling with my faith as a graduate student. Actually, I was at UCLA. And by reading Lewis and Tolkien and other Christian authors, I gradually worked my way back to faith, a much more dynamic faith and a much more personal faith than the one I inherited from my parents. In many ways, his growth arc, part of the reason I called him Tom is he's sort of a doubting Thomas. He starts out the novel as a skeptic, and he challenges both Lewis and Tolkien about, can you really believe in Christian faith in the 20th century? And eventually they bring him around, not through direct argumentation and apologetics, but through imagination and fairy stories and dying god myths. So I would have to say, in some sense, his character arc from skepticism to faith is similar to, I didn't get to meet them personally, but by reading their books, they helped me overcome that chasm from an inherited faith from my parents to a personal faith that I could really make a part of my own throughout my entire life. Great question, Sydney.
It's really interesting. You're writing what you know then.
Exactly.
Putting yourself into the book and the character. All right. Gail Harlow also says an Arthurian tour sounds like fun. When do we leave? So
that would be a wonderful tour, because many of the Arthurian sites, they're in the most beautiful parts of England, Cornwall and Somerset, and they're right there by the ocean, or the beautiful. I didn't mention the Camelot is probably in the 5th century. A fort would not be a beautiful medieval castle with stonework and battlements. It would probably be an earthenwork circle with sort of like Fort Apache. It would probably have timber palisades. So I actually took my students on a tour back in the 80s. Chris and I took a group of students over to England and did an Arthurian tour. And I got out in the rain, and I'd seen it in books, but I got out and said, that is the possible site of Camelot. See that earthen circle, and see that would be the palisades. And then we drove about 2 more miles along this rural road, and it said, possible site of Camelot, Camlin Castle. So it was a lot of fun, even though I actually gave my lecture about 2 miles away from the actual site. But I agree with Gail. That would be a wonderful site. There's a great book by Jeffrey Ash about the historical sites to look for in Camelot. I actually wanted to write a book myself called Arthur Through the Ages, and start out with the historical Arthur that we see through in England, through the romances, and then on, first Welsh, and then French, and then English. So maybe Tom's going to have to write that book for me, but I agree with Gail. That would make a wonderful England tour.
There's nothing like being in England. I think it's a great place to be in
Yeah.
general. So Ted Lewis asked a more general Inklings question. He said, did the Inklings periodically invite newcomer guests to join their pub times?
They did. There were Tuesday mornings at the pub where it was just general conversation. And then there were Thursday evenings in Lewis's rooms, which were more for reading manuscripts and critiquing manuscripts. But it had to be by permission. You were supposed to say, hey, I have a friend, he's a young American, he knows about Arthurian lit. Can I bring him to a meeting on Tuesday, which I have a whole chapter where Tom attends a Tuesday morning Inklings meeting at the Bird and Baby. But they did by permission. As a matter of fact, it was bad protocol. Sometimes Lewis's brother Warren complained that somebody would show up in an Inklings meeting uninvited, and that was bad protocol. You're supposed to check with the others and say, is it okay to have this person join the meeting? But yes, they did allow outsiders, some famous outsiders. Edison, what's his first name? Who wrote the Worm Ouroboros, came to a couple of meetings. Roy Campbell, the Catholic poet, came. Tolkien really liked him. The others were a little bit more tentative about him. But yes, they did allow outsiders to come to a meeting. I'd be kind of intimidated. I would want to sit in a corner and just watch. I wouldn't want them to ask me difficult questions. In my chapter with Tom, they keep pitching him questions, and he wants to just kind of disappear into the corner. He doesn't want to have the spotlight on him with all these brilliant minds around him.
This question from Alan Snyder includes Crystal. How about a collaborative effort where the two of you write a novel incorporating Lewis and Sayers? That would be unique. So what do you guys think of that idea?
That could happen in a sequel. Although when did they
Well,
meet?
actually, when we talked a long time ago, because remember the original novel came out in 2010, and I told David if he did a sequel, the next one, Laura and Tom need to meet the great Dorothy Sayers. So yes, Alan, I have encouraged that idea.
Well, when I gave it to the publishers, they said it's not good to have a novel all from a male point of view. This novel, it's all Tom trying to process what's going on, and Laura, we don't go into her thoughts. And someone said you should do much more like That Hideous Strength, where you have a Tom chapter and then a Laura chapter. So in the sequel, I'm contemplating I would go back and forth between the two characters and get their varying perceptions. I think Dorothy Sayers would have to come into it. I think you're right. Would she come in on a horse with a lance? How would Dorothy Sayers enter the chapter?
But she and Laura would talk about male views of women at the time.
That's true. Yeah. I think that's one thing I missed. If I had to do over again, I would have several Tom chapters interspersed with Laura chapters rather than have it all from Tom's point of view.
And if you want a sneak peek of what it might be like for Lewis and Sayers to hang out in a book, you guys actually do a talk where you play or portray Lewis and Sayers and have them go back and forth with their excerpts from their correspondence. So that's a fun thing to check out on the Wade's YouTube channel if you want a foretaste of what that book could look like.
Chris and I are working on a sequel. Lewis and Sayers only appeared once in public together. They were there to debate Kathleen Knott, who didn't show up. And so they just took questions from the audience. But Chris and I would love to create a scene in which the two of them are on stage together, just taking random questions from the audience, not only criticisms from Kathleen Knott, but other questions about their theology. So we're hoping for a sequel to that event as well.
Mm. Nathan Schock asks an interesting kind of two-part question. He says, I'm reading Patty Callahan's book, Becoming Mrs. Lewis. Have you read the book and what are your thoughts? We obviously know Patty very well, good friend of the Wade Center. But he also asks, what other Inklings books would you recommend? So I think maybe take that first, just because it's something I think that could be of interest to a lot of our viewers to hear what other Inklings books you might recommend if this whets their appetite for that. And maybe you could follow it up with what you think of Becoming Mrs. Lewis.
Right. Well, the classic is Carpenter's The Inklings, written in the 70s, but we've since learned there's a lot of gaps in that and some bit of a slant. Holly Ordway wrote a really important book about Tolkien's modern sources, showing that Tolkien wasn't this reclusive person who seldom wrote letters and who only stuck to authors from the Middle Ages and before. And that's an important balance to our understanding of the Inklings, especially Tolkien. So I would recommend the Zalewski's new biography called The Inklings. I think it's more balanced and it's more comprehensive. It does a lot more with Charles Williams than Carpenter's biography. So I would recommend the new book on the Inklings by the husband and wife team, the Zalewski's. And there's nothing to me like looking at people's letters. You often really understand a person when you hear in their own voice their opinions. Once again, Holly Ordway showed how often you got a distorted view of Tolkien when Carpenter tried to summarize Tolkien. You need to hear Tolkien in his own voice. So I would say read the Zalewski biography. Read Carpenter as kind of the classic, but then update it with the Zalewski biography. And then we're hoping that someone will convince the Tolkien estate to publish a lot more Tolkien letters. There's a whole side of him that people don't know because that material hasn't been available to the public. I
might add just real quick, there's that Inklings in King Arthur book too, which is a nice tie-in with the topics of looking for the king. And I think, did Serena Higgins edit that book?
Right, she did.
Yeah, so it's a number of essays.
All the Inklings were fascinated by King Arthur because there's this combination of chivalry and Christianity that's so fascinating to so many modern Christian authors. And Serena Higgins did a wonderful job collecting essays from a number of people about Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams especially were very influenced by Arthurian legend. So yes, I would definitely add that to the list. I'm glad you mentioned that.
So Patty Callahan's book, Becoming Mrs. Lewis. What do we think about that?
We loved it. There's a good biography by Abby Santamaria, which is a little bit more
a biography of Joy Davidman. For those of you unfamiliar with the topic, Joy Davidman is the Jewish divorcee who became a Christian that Lewis ended up marrying when she came over from America to England. And Abby Santamaria's biography is just fantastic. I recommend it. But Patty Callahan's novel tries to get inside the head of Joy Davidman. So what was she thinking about as she was converting to Christianity, as she was falling in love with the literature first of this C.S. Lewis guy, and then trying to meet him and going through her own marriage problems. And she did something that nobody has ever really done before to try to give voice to Joy Davidman. We are going to be the Wade in October. This is a little secret. The Wade in October will be officially launching Patty Callahan's next novel, which is also about C.S. Lewis, but I can't say any more about it than that.
Stay tuned. Sign up on our news and events.
I think we'd add about Patty that her novel fills in a gap, because many people, they only think of Joy Davidman as the woman who died and broke Lewis's heart and made him write Grief Observed. And she actually shows what it was like, the living person, why she was charming, why she was so witty, why she was so intellectually stimulating. And she recreates these kind of absent years of their marriage, which are the happiest years of Lewis's life. So I think she uses her imagination to fill a gap that many of us have about what it was like to be around. Often fiction can do what biography can't do, which is imaginatively fill in the blanks. And we're very excited about the next novel. We think it's going to be a blockbuster. It's about young people reading Narnia for the first time and how they respond to it, and actually interacting with Lewis about the Narnia Chronicles. That's not, am I being a spoiler alert? We can edit this out later, but it's a wonderful novel. We both read the first draft, and we think it's really going to be a blockbuster this fall.
And I will just add that both Abby and Patty came to the Wade Center to do research for their books, and both worked very diligently because I was there helping them. I saw how hard they worked, so recommended.
Thank you, and their acknowledgments. I think it goes without saying, if it's an important book, they came to the Wade to do some research. I think that more or less goes without saying. If they didn't come to the Wade, you could probably skip that book, because they missed a lot of things they would have learned from Laura or would have learned from our wonderful archives.
I'm always happy to recommend books when I know how hard they did researching them. Right. So yeah. Bob Goldsboro, I'm saving your question for now because it's a really fun one, and great debates can happen in fan groups about this kind of a question. But he asks, if Looking for the King were made into a movie, who would play your two main characters?
Oh, that's a big if. I'm waiting for that to happen. I'd love that. Who would? Well, he's a Californian in his early 20s, and she's from Pennsylvania in her even earlier 20s. She's just out of college. So I'm seeing...
We've never thought about this, so this is hard to come up spontaneously.
Yeah, I would say Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie with a lot of those special effects where they make them a lot younger, like they did in some of the movies. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would make a good movie. There's a wonderful movie coming out called Most Reluctant Convert, in which Max McLean tries to capture Lewis's spiritual journey from being an atheist and kind of an angry agnostic to becoming a Christian. And that's coming out, I think, this summer. We're going to have a launch of that also at the Wade Center. That is a good question. You read these articles about how many different people passed on a great role before somebody actually took the role. So I think it should be two fresh faces that people haven't seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you have to give that some thought, and you can announce later on the podcast when you come up with the perfect pairing of who you think should play these roles. Okay. Well, we have the results in for the book giveaway. So I am going to announce our winners. So the winners of signed copies of Looking for the King are Roy Wallen, Sydney Swanson, and Jane Kimball. So congratulations to our winners, and we will be getting in touch with you for your signed copies, and I hope you enjoy them.
And I have some announcements. First of all, for those of you who didn't win a free copy, for a limited time, you can purchase one of the signed copies of David's novel, Looking for the King, through the Wade Center with a 10% discount and free shipping if you are in the United States. So that's a pretty good deal. All you do is email wade@wheaton.edu and say in your email, I would like to purchase one of the discounted books, Looking for the King. Then be sure to join us on June 17th for another book launch, where we are welcoming Dr. Michael Ward, who has produced a book called After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. It's going to be at 4 p.m. on Thursday, the 17th, largely because he lives in England. And so we needed to put the event earlier in the day. So watch your email for details. If you aren't on the Wade email list, you can sign up using the link that's in the chat box to make sure that you receive future announcements of all these Wade events and other news of things that's going on. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are delighted that you are interested in how, just as Tolkien, Williams, MacDonald, Chesterton, Sayers, well, frankly, all our authors at the Wade, including Lewis, used fiction to communicate the truth of Christianity. And this is what David was trying to do in Looking for the King. How do these myths that developed about the spear of Longinus and the Holy Grail, what do they tell us about people's desires, and how can we use those desires to direct them to the gospel? Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.